Imagine an alchemist standing before a furnace, not as a charlatan chasing literal gold, but as a slow cartographer of the soul, tracing veins of meaning where others see only slag and smoke. The crucible is not a machine, but a metaphor. Heat, dissolution, recombination, processes that mirror the inner work of becoming whole. Carl Jung, encountering the bewildering imagery of medieval alchemy, proposed precisely this. Alchemical texts are a symbolic atlas for the psychological journey he called individuation. In this talk, we will follow that map. We will describe the stages: calcination, solutio, nigredo, albedo, conjunctio, with rubedo as consummation, and translate each into concrete psychological signs, temptations, and supportive responses. We will do so with a sober, contemplative spirit, alchemy as a guide, not a guarantee, depth work as invitation, not prescription. If this subject matters to you and you'd like a guided series on Jungian depth psychology and practical applications, consider subscribing and returning for the next installment. To begin, a brief orientation. Alchemy has a long and tangled history. It appears in Hellenistic Alexandria, in Islamic laboratories, in medieval European workshops. It is at once practical and poetic. Heraclitus's old insistence that everything flows, that nothing is static, resonates here. Change is the ground of being. Mystical voices from John of the Cross to certain strands of Kabbalah and Eastern practice echo similar motifs: the dark night, purification by fire, the paradoxical need to lose to gain. Jung did something decisive. Rather than dismiss the obscure recipes and bizarre diagrams as failed proto-chemistry, he read them as symbolic accounts of inner transformation. For Jung, the images of dissolving metals, of sulfur and mercury, of the marriage of sun and moon, are not alchemical manuals, but psychological symbols pointing to processes we experience in life. Identity collapse, dreams that insist, polarities that must meet. Before we begin the stage-by-stage map, a few definitions so the language remains precise. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes more fully themselves, not merely self-centeredness, but the integration of disparate parts of the psyche, so that a larger center, what Jung calls the self, can emerge. The persona is the social mask we wear to meet the world. The shadow comprises everything relegated to the margins of the ego, often qualities we deny or despise in ourselves. The self, capital S, is an organizing center, not an ego ideal, but a deep symbolic totality toward which a living psyche moves. The transcendent function is the psychological mechanism by which opposites are brought into relation, and something new, a synthesis, arises that was not contained in either pole alone. These terms will recur. I define them plainly now so we can notice their movements within the alchemical stages. Calcination is the first heat. In alchemy, calcination reduces a substance by fire. It burns away impure parts to leave a more essential residue. Psychologically, calcination names the shattering recognition that the identity strategies that once worked are now inadequate. It is often experienced as a kind of burnout, a crisis of meaning, a sudden awareness that the costumes we have worn, professional titles, roles, habitual narratives, no longer fit. Imagine a mid-career engineer who has always derived dignity from competence, whose self-worth is bound to measurable output. One day the project stops satisfying. The praise feels hollow. A thin panic rises when future plans appear scripted rather than chosen. The heat of calcination breaks the brittle certainty that identity is simply performance. What does this feel like? Liberation and loss bracket each other. There can be anger at the system that trained one to equate value with function. There can be shame for having cared so much about approval. There can be a bewildering sense of exposure. The temptation is immediate. Patch the persona back together. We may double down on achievement, work harder to mask the fracture, or seek immediate reassurance through social media validation or frantic busyness. These are understandable moves, but they often amount to false stabilization. They preserve the facade without allowing the necessary reduction. If you recognize yourself here, write in the comments. Staying with the process matters. Supportive responses to calcination are both practical and existential. Practically, slowing down, creating space for honest inventory, and speaking with a trusted friend or therapist can prevent reactive fixes. Existentially, one learns to sit with the discomfort and allow the image of "I am what I do" to dissolve enough that other facets of the personality can be examined. Ritual can help here. A small symbolic act of letting go, burning a list of roles, or writing and ceremonially tearing up an old resume, can give psyche permission to change. But note the boundary. If the collapse is accompanied by severe depression, panic attacks, self-harm, or suicidal thoughts, seek professional care without delay. Calcination may be developmental, but it can also be clinically dangerous in intensity. Discernment and outside help matter. From calcination, the opus moves toward solutio, dissolution. In alchemical terms, solutio is the liquefaction of the calcined residue. Water breaks down the fixed form, making elements mobile so they can recombine. In psychic terms, solutio is the phase in which boundaries soften and the ego's clear lines blur. People report vivid dreams, a heightened sense of symbolism, instances of synchronicity where inner images seem to intersect with outer events. There may be a loosening of habitual certainties. What once seemed obvious is now questionable. This can feel like disorientation. Relationships that used to be predictable become strange. Values that once guided decisions now seem arbitrary. An example. Consider a parent who has defined themselves around caretaking and whose children finally leave home. The silence is not merely factual, it echoes with a question. Now what? The parent may experience dreams of houses with locked doors, of rivers moving into new channels. In solutio, there is often increased emotional permeability. We feel more deeply. We notice subtle pains and yearnings previously shut down. Somatic symptoms sometimes appear: insomnia, digestive changes, a nervous energy. But again, the qualifier is essential. If such symptoms cross into sustained clinical distress, professional consultation is necessary. The temptation in solutio is to flee the ambiguity prematurely. We may seek easy narratives to fill the gap, new hobbies, quick spiritual fixations, or proposals that promise certainty. In therapeutic terms, this can look like spiritual bypassing, using spiritual language to deny legitimate psychological pain. Conversely, some may seek to anesthetize the fluidity through substances, compulsive behaviors, or escapist routines. The healthier path is to cultivate practices that engage the symbol life rather than suppress it. Attentive dream work, creative expression, painting, music, unstructured writing, and reflective solitude that neither avoids community nor demands immediate resolution. Dream journals begin to be important here. Recording images and feelings creates a dialogue between conscious reflection and the imaginal layers that are active in this stage. The next movement is nigredo, the blackening or putrefaction. Alchemically, nigredo is a radical decomposition. Matter appears ruined, black, putrid. Jung recognized nigredo as the deep descent, the psychic dark night, where things fall apart at a core level. Psychologically, nigredo often corresponds to the most painful, bewildering, and threatening aspects of transformation. Old meanings collapse, and there may be a profound confrontation with the shadow. Primitive fears, repressed memories, unattractive impulses, griefs and losses previously buried. Dreams in nigredo are often intense and symbolic in shadowy hues. Falling, being consumed, encountering animals, or death imagery. People describe a sense of annihilation or being abandoned by meaning itself. Because nigredo is the point at which many people disengage, it merits careful attention. It is not merely uncomfortable, it often looks clinically identical to depression, anxiety, or catastrophic crisis. This is why the ethical cautions in Jungian work are essential. To recognize when depth process overlaps with pathology and to act accordingly. If the nigredo stage produces persistent anhedonia, inability to perform daily tasks, suicidal ideation, psychotic experiences, or dangerous stagnation, clinical intervention is urgent. Individuation is not an excuse to romanticize suffering. Rather, it acknowledges that deep work can be risky and must be navigated with competent support. That said, nigredo can also be the site of profound rebirth. The image here is death before rebirth. Seeds rot underground before sprouting. The shadow's confrontation, the slow naming of what was denied, opens the possibility for integration. But many traps exist. One trap is victimhood, collapsing into identity as broken and thereby refusing the possibility of agency. Another is grandiosity. Having faced the abyss, some claim special initiation and begin to see themselves as spiritually superior. A false opus, a counterfeit wholeness. The genuine path through nigredo involves patient resilience, bearing the pain long enough for images to clarify and for small integrative acts to occur. Therapies that combine containment with interpretive work, supportive psychotherapy, trauma-informed approaches, group work where stories are mirrored rather than fixed, are often invaluable. When the darkness yields its first lights, we enter albedo, the whitening. In alchemical practice, albedo follows nigredo as the material is purified and whitened, indicating a new clarity. Psychologically, albedo can bring a relief that is not naive cheerfulness, but an emergent lucidity. The person begins to sense new patterns, recurring motifs become intelligible, and there is a felt brightening of inner space. Dreams may shift from chaotic shadows to images of clear water, moonlight, or white garments. There is often a renewed capacity for creativity and insight. One discovers ways to hold paradox rather than dissolve it prematurely. Before we go on, if you're enjoying the content so far, leave a like on the video. It's a simple signal that this kind of work is worth continuing. Now, let's move forward. Albedo carries its own dangers. The light can seem like completion and provoke premature reconstitution, an eagerness to declare victory and stop the work. Closing too quickly risks re-encapsulation, reforming a persona that appears whiter, purer, more spiritual, but which still hides unresolved shadow elements. Healthy movement in albedo includes deliberate practices that translate insight into lived change, honest conversations that test new ways of being, incremental shifts in relationships that embody new values, and further reflective work to ensure that insights are not simply aestheticized. Conjunctio, the conjunction, describes the marriage of opposites. In alchemical imagery, it may be rendered as sun and moon joined, sulfur and mercury unified, male and female principles reconciled in a productive synthesis. Jung interprets this as the psychological integration of contrary elements, achieved through the transcendent function. The transcendent function, again, is not a tidy synthesis that eliminates tension. It is a meditative, imaginal process by which the unconscious and conscious enter into a productive dialogue that yields a third position, an unexpected movement of the psyche. The conjunctio is not final perfection. Rather, it marks a deeper equilibrium in which the person can hold complexity and engage life from a broader center. At this phase, life often feels more integrated. One's work is not identical to identity. Relationships are more stable because one can tolerate difference. creativity becomes a steady resource rather than a crisis-driven eruption. The self, the central organizing symbol, becomes more present. This does not mean the end of struggle. Rather, it offers a new way of struggling, one that recognizes inner multiplicity and uses it. The image of rubedo, the reddening, can be introduced here as the consummation of the opus, a symbolic achievement of wholeness that is radiant but not absolute. Rubedo is often experienced as a deepened acceptance, not triumphalism, but a tempered joy. The phoenix image is apt, risen from fire, tempered but aware it will face future fires. Individuation is ongoing. Throughout these stages, the phenomenology, the lived appearances, matters as much as the metaphors. Vivid dreams, synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that resist causal explanation. Sudden mood shifts, somatic sensations, and altered aesthetic sensibilities are common markers. Dreams, in particular, constitute a dialectical partner to conscious thinking. They bring forward images that invite interpretation and imaginative response. Paying attention to dreams, recording them, and reflecting on their recurring symbols provide a steady informational stream from the unconscious processes that accompany the opus. At the same time, we must be candid about limits and ethics. Jung's use of alchemy was interpretive. He read symbolic meaning into historical material. He did not claim alchemical operations were instructions for literal physical transmutation. We should honor that hermeneutic move and avoid literalizing the metaphors. Likewise, we must not medicalize transformation, nor trivialize clinical suffering. If a shadow encounter turns into a clinical disorder, the right path is not insistence on symbolic reframing alone, but integration with psychiatric, medical, and psychotherapeutic care. If someone experiences suicidal ideation or severe functional decline, immediate professional help is necessary. Depth psychology appreciates existential dimensions of suffering, but it does not replace acute medical care. Another ethical pitfall is spiritual bypassing, which I have mentioned more than once, because it is common and deceptively seductive. Spiritual bypassing occurs when spiritual language or practices are used to evade unresolved psychological issues. Examples: proclaiming forgiveness without having worked through anger, insisting on unconditional positivity while avoiding grief, using meditation as a means of emotional numbing. The false opus emerges when a person enacts the appearance of transformation, new jargon, curated humility, charismatic aura, without a real reconfiguration of inner dynamics. Gullible communities and guru cultures can cultivate these false opuses, offering belonging at the price of psychological regression. The answer is not simplistic cynicism, but discernment. Favor modalities that foster integration over performance. Practice alongside relational accountability helps. Trustworthy clinicians, thoughtful peer groups, and mentors who balance honesty with compassion. What practices concretely support healthy individuation? I will outline signposts rather than prescriptions because the process is individual and non-linear. First, dream work. Keep a dream journal and cultivate a habit of noting not only plot, but affect, recurring symbols, and intensities. When possible, discuss dreams with a therapist trained in depth modalities or with a reflective peer group. The aim is not forcing interpretation, but developing an openness to the unconscious's messages. Second, creative practice. Art, music, and movement allows symbolic content to be expressed without the immediate demands of logic. You need not be talented. The value lies in process. The alchemical laboratory was messy. The painter's studio is similar. Let materials speak. Third, reflective writing. Journaling that includes active imaginal engagement, writing dialogues with inner figures, composing letters to one's persona or shadow, helps translate images into narrative and ethical choices. Fourth, psychotherapy that knows inner work. Short-term symptom-focused therapy is valuable for stabilization. Longer-term depth work is often necessary to navigate nigredo and conjunctio responsibly. Be frank with therapists about your interest in symbolism and integration. Seek professionals who can hold both clinical and imaginal dimensions. Fifth, community. Individuation is not solitary heroism. It requires mirrors beyond the ego. Friendships and groups that can witness and reflect are essential. These communities should be critical friends, not echo chambers. Sixth, care for the body. Sleep, nutrition, and medical care support psychological resilience. Sound depth work without embodied support is vulnerable to derailment. Finally, ritual and symbolic acts can be supportive. They shape attention and mark transitions. The alchemical process was full of ritualized steps. We can create contemporary equivalents that are meaningful and non-dogmatic. At every point, remember boundaries. Do not stop medication, taper drugs, or change treatment plans without professional guidance. Do not confuse charismatic certitude for psychic growth. And if severe symptoms present, prolonged inability to care for self, suicidal ideation, psychosis, seek emergency care. We should also address why this metaphorical reading matters. Why learn the alchemical map rather than a purely behavioral model of change? The answer is both epistemic and existential. Alchemical imagery gives language to paradox. It holds that destruction can be a form of care, that silence can be a teacher, that opposites may conjoin to yield unexpected third ways. Cognitive behavioral models offer powerful tools for symptom reduction. Jungian alchemy offers a schema for transformation that honors mythic depth, symbolic economy, and the lived phenomenology of change. For people feeling that their lives are being rearranged by events, the alchemical map provides a narrative that contains and names the stages, helps identify common traps, and suggests practices that cultivate patience and imagination. Yet Jung was not infallible. His readings are open to debate. Some scholars argue he overplayed parallels between alchemical texts and the modern psyche. Others insist that his tendency to universalize symbols risks obscuring socio-historical differences. Those critiques are fair. Use the alchemical map as heuristic, not gospel. Test its fit against your experience and against other explanatory frameworks. Before we close, let me return to 3 recurring tensions that shape a sane approach to individuation. First, transformation is both necessary and optional. The psyche's movement toward greater integration may occur through crisis or through slow maturation. Neither is morally superior. Second, suffering is not a moral badge. It is a fact to be navigated with courage, humility, and proper support. Third, wholeness is not a final endpoint, but a way of living, a tempering, a capacity to hold multiplicity without collapsing into facile coherence. The existential core of this work is courage. Individuation asks us to enter uncertainty without guarantees, to stand before the furnace and allow the heat to do what it must. That stance requires more than self-help optimism. It requires patience, community, disciplined attention to images, and the humility to call for professional help when needed. The outcome is not a promised elevation above human fragility, but a deeper attunement to the complexity of life. A person who has encountered shadow and learned to converse with it, who has held opposite claims and allowed the transcendent function to do its mediating work. So picture again the phoenix by the end of the opus. It has risen, yes, but it rises with the knowledge that future fires will come. The gold that hangs in the alchemist's imagination is not trophy, but temper, a capacity to endure and to reforge life under pressure. Wholeness, in Jung's sense, is neither static perfection nor a narcissistic wholeness, but a living humility, the recognition that one's ego is a part, not the whole, and that the self guides us toward a more authentically embodied life. If you want to explore these ideas further, A careful place to begin is Jung's Psychology and Alchemy, along with introductory texts by scholars who translate his concepts into contemporary therapeutic practice. For those who prefer guided study, consider joining a small reading group that pairs Jung's texts with contemporary commentaries. Learning with others provides checks against both isolation and premature certainty. Individuation, when seen through the alchemical lens, reveals itself as a difficult generosity, a process that asks us to give up what we thought made us secure in order to discover a more capacious center. It is less a heroic conquest than a patient, often humbling apprenticeship to the inner images and relationships that shape a life. The furnace will burn, the crucible will smoke, the ashes will darken the hands that tend them. Yet from that very residue, something new becomes possible. An integration that is neither final nor flawless, but real, forged, tempered, and alive. Read Jung with companion texts. Seek clinicians conversant with depth work if you are in the midst of intense change. And remember, courage and support are the two wings needed to fly through the alchemical fire. If you stayed until the end, that already says something about how you approach this kind of work. So write in the comments, "I stayed until the end." I'm placing another video on your screen now. If this way of thinking resonates, you can continue from there. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.